I wanted to make another video after my moral objectivity versus subjectivity video, and I was thinking about what topic I'd want to talk about. And so I decided on the pro-choice versus pro-life argument. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this specifically instead of other issues like gun control or something like that is this specific article I found. And I wanted to do this specific article because of the author. So I guess we'll get straight into this. So the author of this article, which is why I wanted to do this specific article, premises her article, before she lists any points, about how she used to be pro-life and now she changed to pro-choice. And in this premise, she basically says the reason that she was pro-life was because she was a teenager and she was naive and immature and she lacked the ability to approach topics from all possible angles. That's what this premise says. So basically she's saying that pro-life people or people who have pro-life leanings are naive, immature, have the minds of a 14-year-old, and they can't approach this topic from different angles, and they're not open-minded. And so that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this, is because of the lambasting, of the setting your opposition as dumb or ignorant, and then you portraying yourself as the anointed. That's why I wanted to do this. Also, I'll leave the link to the article that I'm talking about in the description. And if I use any sort of source, or if I say any sort of statistic, I'll put the source in the description as well. So her first point out of 15 points is that I am pro-choice because a pregnancy should never be mandatory. A pregnancy never is mandatory. You can choose to have sex or not. I'm actually very pro-choice in that sense. I believe you have the ability to choose whether you have sex or not. The obvious caveat is rape, but this is her first argument against pro-life. This is her first argument being used to cover all abortions, not just rape. This is her first argument she uses. And this is what many pro-choice advocates do. They take the extremes first. They go to the extremes. They go to the life of the mother, rape, incest. They go, and in fact, she goes exactly to those things in this first point too. So they go to the very extremes to justify everything else. Even though less than 1% of abortions are from rape, they use that as the baseline to say that all abortions are okay. If we can agree that the rest of all abortions are wrong, then we can get into rape and other factors like that. But using that to justify all abortions is disingenuous and sophistic. Then she brings up a statistic that 41% of all pregnancies were reported as unintentional, around 85 million. Then she says that the choices of these 85 million women remain their own, and that it doesn't matter why she doesn't want the baby. Says these reasons, however, should not matter. Well, they kind of do matter, because if you're killing a human life for the sake of convenience, she said the reasons don't matter. So the reason could be, she just got pregnant and she just wants to kill it because it's inconvenient. I don't want to have that right now. The author said the reasons that doesn't matter. But if you kill a human because they're inconvenient to you, yeah, that kind of matters. And if there are other factors, like you're not financially ready to support a child, or you're not emotionally ready to support a child, then you should not have had sex in the first place, because that is what makes a baby. If you passed, base level health class, or if your parents gave you the talk. But to that you could say, what if she didn't choose? She was raped. This article isn't about abortion because of rape. This is about abortion widespread. This is about abortion in general. So since she's not specifically talking about just rape, I'm going to keep framing my arguments in the 99% of all abortions, and abortions what she's talking about as well. Like I said, if you're ready to accept that the 99% of abortions are wrong, then we can get into the factors about rape and the life of the mother. So I'm going to keep arguing in the framework that it is assumed that you are choosing to have intercourse. And then to end her first point, she goes on to what I actually said earlier that she does. She goes into the fetus could kill the woman, a fetus resulting from rape, a fetus of a woman who is unable to afford having the pregnancy, which I just addressed. Obviously, if it's a life for a life, if the woman will die, like a perfect example is chemotherapy treatment, where pregnant woman has cancer and she needs chemotherapy treatment or she'll die, but the chemotherapy treatment will kill the baby, then if it's a life for a life in that scenario, yes, that is justifiable because it's a life for a life. Rape is a discussion for another time. I want to stick specifically to the article, and then I already addressed being able to afford it. So now, moving on to the second point she makes, I am pro-choice because sex is a natural aspect of human life. The first line of this point is insane. The first line says, consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. Are you kidding me? You do realize that sex is the only mechanism by which you create another human. Literally the implantation of the male seed. The only argument I've heard trying to justify this is that consent to sex isn't consent to pregnancy if they attempt to use contraceptives like condoms or birth control. Since they're using contraceptives, they obviously aren't consenting to becoming pregnant. The only way that argument would hold up is if contraceptives worked 100% of the time, and they don't. And everyone who uses contraceptives knows that contraceptives don't work 100% of the time. So if you know contraceptives don't work 100% of the time, then you know that there is a risk of pregnancy. So you do know if you're using a condom or if you're using birth control that there is a slight possibility that a pregnancy could occur. So you are fully engaging in the act that could create a human life, knowing full well that that could happen, and then using the excuse that, I tried using contraceptives, I can just kill it now. That's not a valid argument to me. That I don't think that holds up very well. Now, stepping aside from just that first sentence, let's get into her actual argument, which is that it's natural. Sex is natural. The urge to reproduce is natural, so it's okay. First off, just because something is natural doesn't mean it's okay. Plutonium and uranium are natural, but should you stand near them? Should you ingest them? Should you eat them? No, because you'll die. But they're natural, so they must be okay. No, that's not the case. Just because something is natural doesn't mean it's justifiable or okay. Now this is the big kicker. She says, quote for quote, humans are biologically and emotionally inclined to be sexual, and to punish humans for acting as such would negate our nature. She's actually making the argument for rape. She's making the argument that rape is okay. Humans are biologically inclined to be sexual and to reproduce. And to punish them for doing that would negate our nature. A guy going off to rape is just, he has an extremely high sex drive, and he's just trying to reproduce. He has that strong biological urge to go and reproduce. So that I found pretty hilarious. And then she goes on to say, well, I don't mean that everyone should just go around having sex with each other. Well, but why? You just established that we shouldn't be punished for going with our nature. We shouldn't be punished for doing things that are natural. So why shouldn't everyone go around having sex with each other? Then she goes on to say that sex shouldn't be some sacrilegious act that is worthy of condemnation. But she just says all of these things, but she never backs anything up. She never makes any arguments. She just makes a whole bunch of statements. She says that we shouldn't be punished for following our nature, but we shouldn't go around having sex with a whole bunch of people, but sex shouldn't be a sacrilegious, special, contained thing. She just makes all these statements without backing any of them up or showing why. She never says why, she just makes all these statements. So now, moving on to number 3, because number 2 is awful. Number 3 says, I am pro-choice because contraception is frequently unavailable. What could you do if contraception is unavailable? You could probably not have sex. I think that would solve most of the problem. It's so controversial to say that, too. I can hear the people screaming in outrage already about how ridiculous that is. It's not ridiculous at all, really. All it comes down to is personal responsibility. Go ahead and have sex as much as you like, but just don't kill your child because it's inconvenient to you. If you're going to have sex, then go ahead and do it. Just don't kill the child. You can have sex. You can do it. I don't care. Just don't kill your child if it comes to that. That's all I'm saying. That's all what that is about. Now, to support her claim that contraception is frequently unavailable, she says that 61% of federal funding for Title X has decreased. Now, Title X is basically a government-subsidized program for family planning. So basically, it's kind of like a trick. She's saying contraception is frequently or less available than it was because there isn't as much taxpayer-funded programs that offer contraception. That is completely different. Contraception is unavailable because it's not taxpayer-funded and given to me free by the government is not the same as the claim she's making. You can literally just type in the word condoms into Google and you'll find a page comes up immediately. Extremely cheap condoms to buy. And right under it, it also has these statistics for how effective they are too. Like condoms are only 82% effective. And she also says that the inaccurate persecution of Planned Parenthood causes a lack of contraception, which Planned Parenthood is another whole video by itself. There is definitely accurate persecution of Planned Parenthood. Also, she says Supreme Court cases such as Whole Women's Health versus Hellerstedt have contributed to unavailable contraception, which doesn't make any sense because the verdict of Whole Women's Health versus Hellerstedt is that there would be less restrictions on the delivery of abortion services. So if anything, that could only help. This point is just very bad, so let's move on to point number 4, which says, I am pro-choice because bodily autonomy is a basic human right. Okay, there's a lot wrong here right off the bat, so let's get straight into this. First, she frames the argument as dependency, that the fetus doesn't have bodily autonomy, and since it can't self-govern due to dependence, it's justified to be aborted because it's not a human being. She brings up a counterclaim by saying, oh, what if the woman does something harmful to the fetus, such as smoking or drinking, thus impacting its life after birth? That's important. And her response is that if a woman intends on bringing a child into the world, then she has accepted the responsibility to protect it. If she doesn't intend to, then she has no obligation to protect it. That is a completely false dichotomy. She's saying that the intentions determine her obligations to protect the fetus. No, her intention to have sex determines her protective obligations of the fetus, not this arbitrary intent after the fact of the pregnancy. The correct response to this would be, of course, the life support argument. Does a person on life support qualify as a human being, even though they don't have dependency samely as a fetus? She brings this up in her next section of point 4, but then she shifts the argument. She shifts the argument from the beginning, which was bodily autonomy, and since the fetus is simply dependent, etc., 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 she changes the argument to not only just dependent or not bodily autonomous. She changes the argument to physically attached dependency. She puts an emphasis on physical attachment to differentiate between a person on life support and a fetus. Again, this is something that's arbitrary, and she's just using it to shift the argument because she can't successfully argue her first argument. If she's trying to argue that a fetus is not autonomous because it's physically attached to someone, but a person on life support is autonomous because they aren't physically attached to someone, is an arbitrary distinction. The fact that one is physically attached and the other is not physically attached to a person does not transfer autonomy. Physical attachment does not take away autonomy. The fact that they are dependent does. And in the case of someone on life support and a fetus, they both are dependent to live. Even if caring for a dependent fetus in the womb is harder or more difficult or more strenuous than caring for someone on life support, the level of burden a person or human is not justification for killing them or not. I don't think that's a valid distinction or a valid position. If you went by the level of burden, then parents should be allowed to kill their paralyzed children who can't move or can't feed themselves on their own. Because they are dependent, they can't feed themselves, they can't sustain themselves. The parents have to provide them with food in the house, and they have to literally feed them because they can't feed themselves. According to that standard, as well as the life support example, they should be allowed to be killed because of their level of burden, if you're going to make that the standard. Moving on to point number 5, which is, I am pro-choice because I support the mental health and well-being of women. Now, she brings up that pregnancy is not purely physical, but both an emotional and mental health strain. And she cites that globally around 10% of pregnant women and 13% of postpartum women experience some form of mental disorder, and that various medications have harmful effects on the pregnancy. So what she's arguing is that because of 10 to 13% of pregnant women that may experience anxiety or depression from having a baby, which is not surprising at all, then therefore across the board abortions are okay. This is another one of those taking the extremely small amount and expanding it again to cover all abortions. And again, this article is not specific to any circumstances under which abortion would be okay. This is an argument to be pro-choice. These are arguments to be pro-choice. There is no distinction where it's not okay and some of it's okay. This is all okay. So again, if you aren't physically, mentally, or emotionally capable of having a baby, then don't have sex. Moving on to number 6, which is, I am pro-choice because it is time for men to stop dictating the actions of women. Oh boy, reading her explanation on this is, it gives me a headache. It's very SJW awful crap that is just very hypocritical and makes no sense. Her first sentence, or technically her second sentence on this, after it is truly simple, is, if a person does not have the female reproductive organs required to become pregnant, then it is not their place to preach about the morality and pregnancy of choice. The morality of pregnancy and choice, sorry. If a person does not have the female reproductive organs required to become pregnant, what about the female reproductive organs aren't the only thing needed to become pregnant. You need the male organs as well. Women can't become pregnant by thinking about it. You have to have intercourse. There has to be the male organ and the female organ combining to fertilize the egg. And everyone knows this. Everyone should know this, right? It's not just the female organs. 2 people make a baby, not 1. If 2 people make a baby, then both those people should have an equal say in what happens to that baby. It's just simple. This is the real kicker also. It says, if you are a man who disapproves of abortion, you can do your part by not impregnating women. Oh, okay. So this removes any amount of responsibility from women. This puts all of the responsibility on men. The whole point of consensual sex, right, is that 2 people agree. So why are you saying, oh, men, you shouldn't impregnate women then? Why are you putting it just on men? Why don't you say, women, say no to sex? Why are you just saying, oh, you shouldn't impregnate women, men? You should also say, women, don't say yes, say no to sex. They're equally responsible for the decision. That's what I meant about SJW crap and like feminist crap. It's all about man-hating, men's fault. She even says, in a government where men legislate, it's all about men. This is one of the signs of ideology where everything is one thing's fault. If you see someone and they're always blaming one entire thing for the problems of everything, then they're probably ideologically possessed. All right, getting back on track, moving on to point number 7, which is, I am pro-choice because pregnancy and childbirth is a massive financial undertaking. The primary concern of this point is women who are not able to pay for the cost of whatever pregnancy brings, specifically women who are uninsured. Because for women who are insured, the cost is much, much less than women who are not insured. The statistic for uninsured abortions are 33%. The problem is that she assumes that the 33% of these women are poor. The statistic she uses simply says that 33% of women who have had abortions do not have some sort of insurance. Just because a person doesn't have some sort of insurance doesn't mean that they're poor. Any amount of those 33% of women could have been well off, or even middle class, upper middle class, that just chose not to have some sort of insurance. But let's just assume that the 33% of women who did not have health insurance were poor. If they were poor, they most likely would have been able to apply for Medicaid, which she says that 31% of people were covered by that. If you are poor but still not eligible to be accepted for Medicaid. There are several other options, obviously, besides not having sex, which I've said a million times, but there are several other options for financial assistance. There's A, family, B, your local church, C, your community that you live in, and D, charities across the country. If you have a family, and if you have a at least decent family, I'm sure they will financially try to support you during that time if you really need it. Also, churches are very well known for providing support for people, financial support also. Your local community, if you're active in your local community, and if you know people, you can try to ask for help from your community. And then charities. There are several financial aid charities, private charities, church charities also goes back to church, not just your local church, but there are Catholic charities. There are several charities that can help with financial assistance. I will put some links in the description below for some things that I found, some charities that I found, organizations also, that all help with financial assistance. Also that help with financial assistance specifically to health-related payments, healthcare-related bills, and medical bills. I think I covered most of that point. So moving on to point 8, which says, I am pro-choice because there are too many orphaned children in the world. Basically what she's saying is that since there are already so many orphaned children waiting to be adopted, that you might as well just be able to kill your child, because killing your child is better than giving birth to them and adding them to the list of adopted children that are already there. For some reason, that's the argument. Well, anyway, moving on to point number 9. I am pro-choice because a woman's sexual health and reproductive choices are none of my business. Okay, that's just rhetoric. There's nothing there. She just has that as like rhetoric. So, moving on to number 10. I am pro-choice because teenage pregnancy is still incredibly prevalent. Now, I could go on a rant talking about how stupid teenagers are, but everyone knows teenagers are stupid, so I'm just going to try to stick to the article. Yes, teenage pregnancy is a problem. But your solution to that problem is to just allow them to kill their child whenever they get pregnant. Not only is that a slippery slope for the moral fabric of society, but it's also a slippery slope in the fact that allowing teens to just get an abortion every time they get pregnant won't reduce the amount of teen sex. That's one of my problems with sex education. Sex education doesn't aim to reduce sex. It aims to reduce pregnancies and STDs. My focus, my goal, what I want is to reduce teen sex. If you focus on reducing teen sex to begin with, it hits 2 birds with 1 stone. By reducing teen sex, you automatically reduce the chances of teen pregnancy and teen STDs. Easy abortions for teens is a slippery slope because that will incentivize them to have sex more. If they can have sex more and just get rid of the baby by killing it, then they're just going to do it over and over and over. Because that's basically no consequence. It basically removes consequence. So that won't reduce sex. That'll incentivize teens to have more sex because they can just get rid of it. So that will automatically increase the chances of a higher teen pregnancy rate and a higher teen STD rate. Not to mention increasing the rate of dead children. Also, her first sentence for this point number 10 is that teen pregnancy rates are reducing and have been reducing. So let's just keep that in mind for the next point, which is point number 11, which says, I am pro-choice because the U.S. still lacks quality sex education. Honestly, I don't think there's a coincidence between the lack of widespread sex education and the declining of teenage birth rates. Might be because it doesn't work, but anyway, first thing she says here is that it's no secret that abstinence-only education doesn't work. And I'll put some stuff in the description. I'll put some links in the description to support that abstinence-only does actually work. She also says that adolescents who receive well-rounded sex education, quote-unquote, are 60% less likely to become pregnant or impregnate someone, as opposed to those who receive no sex education. See, she doesn't put the parallel between sex education and abstinence education. She puts the parallel between people who've had sex education and no sex education. Because the study she uses even says that the difference between abstinence and sex ed are statistically insignificant. Also, the 60% number was taken from a survey, which aren't always reliable, from around, I think, 1,700 people. So she's using a survey of 1,700 people to say that 60% of all adolescents across the board who had sex ed are better off, which is more sophistry. Now, as a treat, I'm going to read to you an excerpt from the famous Thomas Sowell's book, The Vision of the Anointed, about sex education and its implementation when it first started coming around in the late 60s into the 70s and 80s and even the early 90s. So I'm going to read an excerpt of that part. The results. As early as 1968, nearly half of all schools in the country, public and private, religious and secular, had sex education, and it was rapidly growing. As sex education programs spread widely through the American educational system during the 1970s, the pregnancy rate among 15 to 19-year-old females rose from approximately 68 per thousand in 1970 to approximately 96 per thousand by 1980. Among unmarried girls in the 15 to 17-year-old bracket, birth rates rose 29% between 1970 and 1984, despite a massive increase in abortions which more than doubled during the same period. Among girls under 15, the number of abortions surpassed the number of live births by 1974. The reason was not hard to find. According to the Alan Guttmacher Institute, the percentage of unmarried teenage girls who had engaged in sex was higher at every age from 15 through 19 by 1976 than it was just 5 years earlier. The rate of teenage gonorrhea tripled between 1956 and 1975. Sergeant Shriver, former head of the Office of Economic Opportunity, which led the early charge for more sex education and, quote, family planning, unquote, clinics, testified candidly to a congressional committee in 1978. Quote, just as venereal disease has skyrocketed 350% in the last 15 years when we have had more clinics, more pills, and more sex education than ever in history, teenage pregnancy has risen, unquote. Such candor was, however, the exception rather than the rule among those who had pushed for sex education and birth control, family planning, clinics. However politically useful public concern about teenage pregnancy and venereal disease might be in obtaining government money and access to a captive audience in the public schools, the real goal was to change students' attitudes. Put bluntly, to brainwash them with the vision of the anointed, in order to supplant the values they had been taught at home. In the words of an article in the Journey of School Health, sex education presents an exciting opportunity to develop new norms. Only in the light of this agenda does it make sense that so-called sex education should be advocated to take place throughout the school years, from kindergarten to college, when it could not possibly take that much time to teach basic biological and medical information about sex. What takes that long is a constant indoctrination in new attitudes. An example of such indoctrination may be useful. A popular sex instructional program for junior high school students, aged 13 and 14, shows film strips of 4 naked couples, 2 homosexual and 2 heterosexual, performing a variety of sexually explicit acts, and teachers are warned with a cautionary note from the sex educators not to show the material to parents or friends. Many of the material of this program shown to people outside the context of the program itself can evoke misunderstandings and difficulties. Parents who learned of this program and protested were quickly labeled fundamentalists and right-wing extremists, even though that they were in fact affluent Episcopalians in Connecticut. Here is an almost textbook example of the vision of the anointed, preempting the decisions of parents as to when and how their own children shall be introduced to sex, and dismissing out of hand those with different views. Nor was this episode peculiar to this particular school. Similar things have happened all over the country. Parents are denigrated both in discussions of public policy and in the materials given to students in the schools. A typical comment from experts is that sex and sexuality have become far too complex and technical to leave to the typical parent, who is either uninformed or too bashful to share useful sexual information with his child. Gotta love Thomas Sowell. Anyway, I think I've made my point, so I'll move on to her next point, which is point number 12. I am pro-choice because I support freedom of religion. Oh yeah, I bet you do. I bet you do, sure. Basically, the argument I think she's trying to make is that you shouldn't be allowed to make laws based on religious morality or based on religious intentions or religious beliefs. Which is stupid, specifically because she's invoking the First Amendment, and having a religious belief that makes you want to pass a law, or having a law being passed because you have a religious intention, does not go against the First Amendment at all. The First Amendment prohibits Congress from making a law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Having a religious intention or using your religious beliefs for wanting a law to pass does not establish a religion. The establishment of a religion would be like in England, where the Church of England is the established church of the state. Having a voter say, "Oh, I want this law to pass because the Bible says so," does not go against the First Amendment or freedom of religion. Moving on to point number 13, which is, I am pro-choice because illegal and unsafe abortions should never be the last resort. You're right, it never should be the last resort, because there are already 4 other choices you can make besides abortion. There's 1, not having sex, 2, using contraception, 3, putting up the child for adoption, or 4, becoming a mother. You have 4 options at your disposal that don't require killing the child. Now, she uses global statistics for this, and the only reason I assume she uses global statistics is because if she used nation-by-nation statistics, the numbers would probably be too small and statistically insignificant. So the argument she's making is that abortion should be legal because people are going to have abortions regardless of if it's legal or not. People are going to do self-induced abortions, and you might as well make it legal so that at least it's safe. That's the argument she's making. For her statistics, she lists that more unsafe abortions happen in countries with very restrictive abortion laws opposed to countries that have very open abortion laws which have less unsafe abortions. Whether purposely or unpurposely, she neglects to mention that nearly all of the countries with extremely restrictive abortion laws are all third world developing countries. Does she really think it's a good idea to have unrestricted or barely limited abortions in third world developing countries? Does she think that will solve anything? Does she think that will solve any issues? Does she think that won't cause other problems inherently? It's a third world developing country. Even if you make abortion unrestricted, that doesn't mean it's going to be a safe abortion. It can be completely legal and still be completely inadequate in terms of medical equipment and proper medical officials. Maybe the reason that there's so many unsafe abortions in these third world countries isn't just because that abortion is restrictive. Maybe it's because they lack the medical equipment or medical expertise to provide safe abortions in the first place. Developing countries in Africa are going to have more unsafe abortions regardless of its restrictive abortion laws or not. It's just a hunch, but I think if there were any examples of truly first world developed countries that had very restrictive abortion laws, it wouldn't be showing the numbers that Africa and South America are showing. Moving on to number 14, which is, I am pro-choice because abortion is not equivalent to murder. And here she goes and starts comparing a fetus to leaves and yeast and cows, because they're all alive, just because it's alive, yada yada yada. How can you even compare a human fetus to a leaf? It's just ridiculous. Humans have infinite potential. We have innate infinite potential. Leaves don't. Cows don't. There's set purposes for these things. Humans have infinite potential, and we are infinitely valuable. If you're going to use the bundle of cells argument, technically, fully grown humans are bundles of cells too. How far do you want to take this battle of deceptive euphemisms and metaphors? It's ridiculous. She even goes as far as to say that even though a fetus may have a beating heart, developing neurological structures, or identifiable digits, that doesn't mean it's murder. She's saying that killing a fetus with a beating heart is not murder, with identifiable digits, and that is developing. If you want to get into the euphemism war again, technically humans after birth are still developing. So are you going to use developing as your baseline for it's not murder? She goes on to talk about pain and how the baby fetus doesn't feel pain until this many weeks. So if you're setting pain as your guideline, then why can't we just kill someone who's in a coma because they won't feel the pain? You can just kill them and they won't feel it. Or someone who's asleep. If you're asleep and I shoot you in the back of the head, you're not going to feel pain. You're asleep. So setting pain as the guideline is arbitrary, and it can be applied to other things that aren't consistent with your position. If you are admitting that you are killing a living human being, there is absolutely no moral justification. Sure, you might be able to make a pragmatic argument, but you have zero moral justification. That was one of the big things during this election, too, is that they were trying to make it a moral thing. Like, being pro-choice is a moral position, and it's completely not at all. Here's the bottom line. No person's DNA is exactly the same. Even identical twins don't have a 100% of the same DNA. DNA and genetic code are the best biological indicators of an individual. And DNA and genetic code are created instantly at conception. So life does begin at conception. And if it is an innocent human life that can't protect itself and you kill it, it is murder. Her 15th point is just, oh, I'm pro-choice because I support the empowerment and advancement of women. It's like number 9. It's not even a point. It's just rhetoric. So basically, she really doesn't even have 15 points. It's more like 13. She just has 2 of them be rhetoric. So that's the end of this article that I've rebutted. Hopefully, I did a good job. Anyone who watches, I'm not sure if it'll be a lot of people, but just anyone who watches, let me know in the comments how I did, where you think I got things wrong, certain points, arguments. It's a lot better if you address my specific arguments and points. It'll be a lot easier. Subscribe if you want more of these, because I probably will make more. It just takes me a long time because I procrastinate a lot, and it takes me a lot of time to record the audio. Like, this is almost a 40-minute video. It's so freaking long. I'm so sorry. This is so long. But anyway, that's the end of the video, and I'll see you in another one maybe.